Thank you. So I'm James Scott. I'm a technical writer at Moogsoft, and today I'm going to be talking about GraphQL and hopefully answering the question, is GraphQL really self-documenting? So my GraphQL journey started about a year ago when a couple of my colleagues were looking at new ways to develop their APIs and started looking at GraphQL. I thought it looked quite cool, so I was like, oh, can I help you document that? And one of the developers said, no, it's fine. It documents itself. Needless to say, I was skeptical. Two things I've learned as a technical writer. Nothing is completely foolproof. You might think you've got this product that has the best UX design, but users are still going to make mistakes, and they like having the docs as a safety net to fall back on. The other thing I learned is don't take documentation advice from developers. It's always best to double check, do your own research. So that's what I did, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So what is the problem? Developers think GraphQL is self-documenting. It doesn't need documentation. So I'm going to talk about what we mean by self-documenting. And then I'm going to talk about GraphQL, where it came from, what it is, what it looks like. And then hopefully at the end I'm going to share with you my conclusion. Is GraphQL self-documenting? So my first port of call for my research was Twitter. Lots of developers were saying very positive things about the self-describing, self-documenting features, aspects of GraphQL. So this guy said, with GraphQL, you don't even need docs. And this guy said he loved the self-describing organism and autocomplete. It took me a while, but I finally found one developer who didn't like the docs. He said, the documentation for most things I've seen concerning GraphQL is absolutely abysmal. So I thought I might be onto something when I found that tweet. And he also gave this example of a filter field which has a description, just self-descriptive. That's it. So what does self-documenting mean? We're basically talking about something that's written or structured in such a way that it can be understood without documentation or prior knowledge. And I found a great, similar definition in PC Magazine online. But below it had this warning which said it's very subjective. What one programmer thinks is self-documenting may be indecipherable to another, which got me thinking about subjectivity. So we've got this message broker at work at Moogsoft called RabbitMQ. And one day on Slack, there was this poll discussing the RabbitMQ logo. And we had this debate about whether the RabbitMQ logo was a rabbit's head or whether it was a little rabbit with a white tail. I couldn't remember who won that poll, but it's totally subjective. There's this danger that things can be interpreted two different ways. And you also get subjectivity with words. So these are all homographs. They're words that are spelt the same, but they are pronounced differently, or they've got multiple meanings. So if you were to name your GraphQL query second, are we talking about a unit of time, or are we talking about number 2 in a sequence? If we chose number, are we talking about a numerical value, a quantity or an amount? The verb to count, to number something, or probably least likely in software, more num than something, number. And then we've also got subject. So subject can be a topic, it can be the noun in a sentence, or it can be a verb, to subject someone to something. So when I mentioned this talk to the engineering director at Moogsoft, he said he thought self-documenting code was a unicorn. He couldn't remember a single example of self-documenting code in all of his years of experience. And similarly, a developer called Alexander Kalinuk posted on Hackanoon that he had spent his career sort of thinking he was writing self-documenting code, but it didn't pass the single appropriate test, and that was the test of being read by someone who wasn't him. And others have said similar. So there's this tweet by Nicholas Zakis who said self-documenting code is a myth perpetuated by those who hate to write documentation. And Eric Holscher, who's the co-founder of Write the Docs, he wrote this blog where he said similar. He said self-documenting code is one of the biggest documentation myths in the software industry. And he gave this great just example of what self-documenting code boils down to. So basically, you've made something, an object, a function with a specific use case. You've given it a name that explains that use case. And then you conclude it doesn't need docs because it's obvious how it works. And he basically said the issue with this mindset is it makes it harder for normal people to use your software. So what is GraphQL and where did it come from? So GraphQL basically came from Facebook. I can't remember if you will remember, but they released this web app that was built on HTML5, and it had a lot of bugs. It was slow. It ended up with a load of 1-star ratings in the App Store. And Mark Zuckerberg said it was one of their biggest mistakes. They lost 2 years of time. So they had to build a native app. And the guy leading the newsfeed team was Lee Byron. And he, basically, his team produced this prototype that for the newsfeed. And they'd used this old partner API. And as a result, it was missing a load of the stories. So he realized he was going to have to develop a new kind of API. Luckily for him, Nick Schrock had been working on this prototype to expose the data infrastructure on the server side. And he'd called this thing Supergraph. So the two of them paired up, and they were introduced to Dan Schrafer, who was he was hailed as like the best newsfeed engineer at the time. And then the three of them came up with GraphQL. So it was production ready in about 2012. It was just released internally at first. So Newsfeed was the first app to use it. Subsequently, the Photos team, the Events team, and then all these other ones like the Messenger, Facebook Lite, Android Newsfeed. And it was so powerful that over 1,000 versions of these apps are still using the very first version of the GraphQL API. And so basically, due to the popularity in Facebook and after the success of releasing their open source library React, they decided they wanted to open source it. And Relay, which was inherently tied to it, they also wanted to open source. So GraphQL was open sourced in 2015. And as I've said, so the first people to use it were Facebook. Subsequently, it was picked up by GitHub, which was kind of significant for them because they're seen as a sort of API leader. And then a host of others like Amazon and Twitter, Walmart, Airbnb, Sky, Shopify, all picked it up as well. And even some smaller organizations like, so this is the Ethiopian movie database. They're using GraphQL. And then PayPal, they're the most recent people to say they're using it internally. All these ones that are ticked all have public GraphQL APIs, so if you want to have a look at them and play around with them, you can. So what is GraphQL? Essentially, it's a data query language for APIs that you can use to retrieve data using a query or change or modify data using a mutation. And you can specify the exact data you want, so there's no underfetching or overfetching of data. And all these things are done over a single endpoint. So a key principle when you're thinking about GraphQL is to think in graphs, which can be quite daunting if you're not a mathematician, graph theory. But I'm actually going to repeat something Lorna said earlier. So you can think of your model of your GraphQL data as a tree, much like the Open API spec. So you can start with your root node. So in this case, if you've got, this is going to be a Lord of the Rings GraphQL API. So you've got your root object, which is a book in this case. You've got your related fields, which are your title, and whether in the fellowship. And then you've got your branch nodes, the members of the people in Fellowship of the Ring, and then your leaf nodes. Their name is and their races are the leaf nodes. And without the tree, your graph looks something like this. So what does a query actually look like? In its most basic form, it's something like this. So if you wanted to query the object's hero and return his name, you get something like this. So you get Frodo returned as a string. you can also return related objects. So in this case, I want to find out the companions of my hero, and they're returned as an array like that. I also want to touch upon overfetching. So some people have kind of said that GraphQL avoids overfetching, and they say that's kind of like an advantage over REST. I mean, you can avoid overfetching with REST as well, but I'm going to give an example of a REST API call sent via curl. So if you wanted to get like the name and the height and the age of character ID with the ID 6, you might get this big block back. It's a load of data you didn't want. So that's kind of overfetching. But with GraphQL, you can really customize that endpoint. You can, if you want that, you want your name, your height, and your age for that character, you can specify for that exact data. And that will be returned something like that. And then again, so you've got mutations as well. So with mutations, you're adding something to the data. So in this case, I'm adding the category hobbits to the characters 1, 2, 7, and 8. And that will return something like that. So you've added a category there. So this is graphical. This is the other core component of GraphQL. It's an integrated development environment where you can sort of explore the schema. But I was just thinking, if you stripped away like any docs and you landed on this, I think it would be quite intimidating. What am I supposed to do here? Like, imagine landing there with no idea of what your schema looks like, how to structure a query, or what queries are even possible. I think if you're like me, you're likely to want to click the docs button. So this is GitHub's public-facing API. They have some great supporting docs. But I wanted to test some of my colleagues, so I conducted an experiment. I stripped out all of this introductory text and the example query they give you, and I challenged them to try and find out my GitHub name, my location, and my avatar URL. And there was a lot of trial and error. So they made mistakes like this, which returned this error. So basically, in that case, they had assumed that my name was a field, which it wasn't. And they were missing an argument. And they didn't use the braces as well. That was another issue. But we had lots of, there were lots of things like parsing errors, syntax errors, not using these braces. So it wasn't that intuitive. Another issue I've noticed when looking at some of the public APIs, so this is an unofficial Pokemon GraphQL API. They just assume that you know what a Pokedex is. And again, they've used this description of just self-descriptive. And I can't remember which one this was, but this was just another unofficial one, where again, they'd use self-descriptive, and in the Docs Explorer, it just said no description. I don't think anyone's going to be able to figure out what that does. So what is the answer? I really don't think it's helpful to just write self-descriptive as a description. Lee Byron, one of the co-founders of GraphQL, he spoke about the importance of naming at the GraphQL Summit in 2016. And he said naming things is super important when you're designing GraphQL APIs. It's important to ask yourself, would a new engineer understand this? Avoid using code names and server-side lingo. And he also said it's really important not just to have names that are good, but to have names that are self-documenting. Naming things that adhere closely to what those things actually do is really important to make this experience actually work. But given that quite a few people seem to be missing this piece of advice, I took a look in the spec, and it says that documentation is a first-class feature of GraphQL type systems, and that providing types and fields and arguments with descriptions is important unless they're considered self-descriptive. So I'm wondering if that line is where people have got that from. You might also notice there's an A missing there. That was my first open source contribution. So if you go to the spec, that might be there now. So I wanted more answers. I decided to email Lee, who edits the spec, and get a definitive answer. And 2 weeks later, to my surprise, he wrote back and said, yeah, I'd be up for a chat. So we spoke about GraphQL for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes. He told me all about the story of how GraphQL came about, how he hopes to see it develop. And when I asked him about documentation and the importance of descriptions, he shared these words of wisdom with me.
APIs are a design problem way more than they're a technical problem. And you know this better than anybody else if you're working on documentation, right? Because if there's no documentation, it doesn't matter how good the API is. Because so much about what makes an API work well is mapping well to your internal mental model for how something works, and then helping explain those linkages and the details. And if you do that wrong, it doesn't matter how good your API is, people aren't going to be able to use it. And GraphQL doesn't do that for you. It provides some clear space to do that, right? There's like the types and the fields and introspection. You can add descriptions in places. So it wants to help you. Mm-hmm. But if you don't put in that thought and you end up with a poorly designed API, that's not necessarily GraphQL's fault, right?
So that was kind of my success kid moment. Having the co-creator of GraphQL give me the answer I was looking for was pretty cool. He essentially said, if there's no documentation, it doesn't matter how good the API is. If you do that wrong, people aren't going to be able to use it. And he talked about how GraphQL can be self-documenting, but it doesn't do that for you. It provides the clear space for you to do that. So I'm just going to quickly look at some of the spaces that you can fill. So the descriptions is the most obvious place to do that. So this is the Star Wars API. If you fill those descriptions in, they're going to appear here in GraphQL, which is probably going to be most people's sort of first, the first place they interact with your GraphQL API. And there are other sort of docs features in GraphQL that are going to help you along the way, or help your end user along the way. So as well as the inline descriptions, there's autocomplete, so you can hit enter as you're typing. You can also hover over any of the fields you've written in to get the hover tooltips. On Macs, you can use option space to get a list of all available fields. And there's also introspection, so you can actually query the schema itself and try and find out all the available query fields or mutations or types. And then you've got the Docs Explorer, which has got search. So there are some other IDEs like GraphQL out there. There's GraphQL Playground and Insomnia, which are very similar. They've just got more sort of bells and whistles. There's also GraphQL Voyager, where you can sort of explore your API as an interactive graph. It's quite cool because you can kind of see a wider view of the schema, how things relate to each other. And there's also GraphQL Docs and GraphQL Docs. So these are two open source projects on GitHub. So you give them the schema file and they'll generate you a static site. See, the problem with all of these is I don't think the docs they're producing is very human. So Carolyn Stransky, she's a former tech writer turned developer. She spoke at GraphQL Finland last month. And she spoke about a number of blockers that she was encountering while trying to learn GraphQL. Essentially, the key one was an unhealthy reliance on the self-documenting aspects of GraphQL. She talks about encountering a lot of unexplained jargon and lots of assumed knowledge, which I've mentioned already. And she felt all of these things could have been resolved if there'd been more care in the documentation. So what are other tech writers saying? So Chris Ward wrote a blog about whether GraphQL reduces the need for documentation. And he basically concluded that you still need the contextual documentation. You know, it's all well and good at saying this endpoint does that, but it doesn't say how it relates to the other tools. And then Andrew Johnson, who spoke earlier, spoke about GraphQL last year, and he spoke about the importance of giving your brand new user this sort of hand-holding documentation, telling them the sort of basics of GraphQL. Don't just assume they're going to know how to formulate a query or a mutation. So just some sort of tips for documenting GraphQL. So like Andrew Johnson said, provide that onboarding, hand-holding docs. Get them familiar with the basics. And you can also do API-specific docs, so provide queries and mutation examples from your API, provide supporting docs for specific use cases, and in the API itself, you can make sure you use appropriate names for your fields and your types and your arguments, and use good descriptions in the schema. So this might be the end of my talk, but I don't think GraphQL is the end of the road for API technical writers. GraphQL can be self-documenting, but only if you fill the spaces that it provides for you, and add the supporting docs. Without those things, it's just not going to work. And if anyone disagrees with you, you can tell them that one of the guys who created it says otherwise. Thank you.